Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Ian Hutchinson, who is Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and former head of the Nuclear Science and Engineering Department. He began his life here and is an MA in Natural Sciences from Cambridge. He was at King's College, and then he did his PhD in Engineering Physics at the Australian National University. He's an expert in plasma physics and nuclear fusion, and he's also got a great interest in the interrelationship of science and faith. He has assisted the American Association for the Advancement of Science in their dialogue on science, ethics and religion. We've got his book on scientism on the bookstall, and he is a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation. So it's a great pleasure to have you again on physics and faith.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you again for getting up bright and early to be with us. Tomorrow was, yesterday was a splendid day, an onslaught of ideas and information. And so this morning I want to give a slightly different type of presentation, change the pace a little bit. Part of my motivation for this is the observation that physicists are actually very religious. This might be to you a surprising claim, but I mean this in a quite broad sense. The religiosity of physicists is quite often not associated with participation in formal religious activities, but nevertheless many of them have religious beliefs. Einstein's perhaps the most famous in his quotes about, whether God plays dice or whether science without religion is whatever the epithet should be. And there are many pithy religious sayings of scientists. Actually, physicists are often guided in their science to some degree by their theological perspectives. Sometimes those theological perspectives are right, sometimes they aren't right. I wanted to tell a story about my own experience as an undergraduate here at Cambridge. As was mentioned, I was at King's College, and the second year, my tutor, those of you who know the Cambridge system, in addition to lectures, there are tutorials where two students meet together with usually a senior researcher or scientist of some sort. My tutor, and this is a long time ago, was actually Narlika. He didn't look like this then. This is a more recent picture. But he was a co-worker with Fred Hoyle, a collaborator of Fred Hoyle. And Narlika, his big thing was cosmology, and he and Hoyle, of course, both were investigating and trying to promote the idea of a steady-state universe. And this was in the late 60s, early 70s, and even then, as I pointed out yesterday, we had extremely good evidence that, in fact, the Big Bang had taken place, that we had the 3-degree background radiation and so forth. And so it was a little surprising, even to me, an undergraduate, that someone like Narlika would be still promoting the steady-state view of the universe, of the cosmos. So I asked him at one tutorial, well, why steady-state universe? And the answer he gave me was almost entirely a kind of philosophical and theological answer. He said, well, it just seems more attractive. It seemed more attractive to him that, well, the universe is infinite in all directions, he says, so why shouldn't it be infinite in the direction of time as well as in space? As far as I know, he's still a steady-state advocate, despite the evidence which was talked about more extensively yesterday for the fact that the universe, as we know it, had a beginning. Now, I'm actually an applied physicist, and I work in plasma physics and control fusion, as was just mentioned. And probably that lends itself less to a religious influence on its thinking than other less applied physics, although perhaps not in its application. Now, physicists' stories, I think, are actually, at least the religious stories, are very rarely told. We often hear a lot about the scientific activities of physicists, but we generally, I think, hear a lot less about their religious stories. And I'm not a storyteller by nature, which is one reason why I need to bring a script for this story that I'm going to tell you. It's not going to be my story I'm going to tell. I'm more of an object, idea-focused person, like many scientists with me. But I think you can't really well understand the relationship between science and faith without at least some acquaintance with the relationship between scientists and faith. And that means, I think, telling their stories. So we can learn both from the explanations that they give, but also from their actions. And so what I want to do for most of this lecture is to tell the story of a particular scientist of history, and I want to invite you, as I tell the story, to try to think about what this person said, but also what he did, and how that reveals the relationship in this person between science and faith. Most of this material actually comes from an occasional seminar series that we've offered at MIT entitled The Faith of Great Scientists, and we have as a kind of mantra for this seminar series that we ask the question, how did the Christian faith, which so many great scientists over history professed, influence their science, and how did their science influence their faith? And so the scientist that I want to talk about today is James Clerk Maxwell, and this story is called James Clerk Maxwell and the Christian Proposition, for reasons which I think you'll find as I read through. Two great British scientists dominate the intellectual landscape of electrical science, and indeed all of physics, in the 19th century. Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell. It would be hard to imagine two more contrasting personalities. Faraday was English, Maxwell was Scottish. Faraday was the son of a poor blacksmith. Maxwell's father had inherited the substantial estate and hardly needed to practice the law in which he had been trained. Faraday had no formal education. Maxwell had the finest education available. Faraday never held a university position. Maxwell held professorships at 3 of the major British universities. Faraday was one of the most popular scientific lecturers of his day. Maxwell gained a very poor reputation in the classroom. Faraday knew practically no mathematics. Maxwell was one of the finest mathematicians of his time. Faraday's research dominated electromagnetic experiments, Maxwell's electromagnetic theory. The contrasts between these men could be multiplied on and on. Yet they had one experience in common. Both were committed Christians. And the purpose of this is to explore the faith of James Clerk Maxwell. We should recall Maxwell's contributions to science. They extend over a wide variety of fields, including optics, color vision, elasticity, and the behavior of the dynamical top. The work that established him as a foremost natural scientist was his analysis of Saturn's rings, in which he showed that they couldn't be rigid, but they had to be made up of swarms of particles whose stability he analyzed. Perhaps inspired by this early work, Maxwell was also the first person to apply the methods of probability to the analysis of the properties of gases. So he invented the idea of a distribution function governing the velocities of individual molecules of the gas, and he proposed the Maxwellian, or sometimes called Maxwell-Boltzmann expression for the equilibrium form of that distribution. Maxwell went on to work out concrete predictions that could be obtained from the kinetic theory of gases, for example, concerning the viscosity, and he performed experiments to confirm those predictions. However, the work that he is most remembered for is his formulation of the equations that govern electromagnetism, Maxwell's equations. And if I were at MIT, I would expect all of the students to understand these equations that I've put up here, but I'll let you off the hook. There won't be a test later. Those equations led immediately to the prediction of electromagnetic waves and the consequent unification of electromagnetism and light. And Maxwell's formulation of electromagnetic theory in differential form and his championing of the fundamental nature of the field in contrast to the action at a distance theories of his day is, of course, the basis for essentially all of modern physics. Besides his personal scientific contributions, Maxwell founded and built the Cavendish Laboratory of Experimental Physics here at Cambridge University, which was to be arguably the most prolific physics department for the next 50 years. The reason why the normal references are to James Clerk Maxwell, as opposed to just James Maxwell, is bound up in the highly complicated inheritance of James's father, John. The early Maxwells, owners of the enormous estate of Middleby, had attempted to protect the estate from dismantlement by their subsequent heirs through a variety of legal entanglements called entails, including the requirement that it could only be inherited by someone bearing the name Maxwell. Actually, despite those extreme measures in the 18th century, George Clerk Maxwell, by an act of Parliament, succeeded in selling off all but a relatively small part of the estate. That part was the 1,500-acre estate in Galloway, southern Scotland. He did it to cover debts that he had incurred in mining speculations that were associated with his geological interests. So, as a result, it was a much more modest estate that John Clerk, Maxwell's father, inherited in the early 19th century, but one for which it was still well worthwhile changing his name to John Clerk Maxwell in order to be able to inherit. Thus, when in 1826, James's father, at age 36, married Frances Kay, they settled at the estate, which later became known as Glenlair, and determined to build a grand manor house there and revive the fortunes. This was an ideal outlet for John's scientific and technical interests. He was, by the way, a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. A daughter born to the Maxwells did not survive, but James was born on the 13th of July, 1831, at 14 India Street in Edinburgh. For the first 8 years of his life, spent at the estate, a day's journey from the nearest city, which was Glasgow, his education was entirely in the hands of his mother. He seems to have shown an astonishing memory even in the early years. At 8, he could recite long passages of Milton and the whole of the 119th Psalm, which, as many of you will realize, has 176 verses. Indeed, his knowledge of Scripture was already very detailed. He could give chapter and verse for almost any quotation from the Psalms. Clearly, from this early age, a devout Christian faith and demanding mental discipline were, for Maxwell, part of the same experience. He also showed intense interest in the workings of things. his standard question was, and you must excuse my Scottish accent, which is hopeless, okay? His standard question was, what's the go of that? Which would be followed up immediately, if the answer did not satisfy him, with, but what's the particular go of it?
I thought you said he was Scottish, not Irish.
I already gave my apologies. Martin, I'll have you come to do the reading.
Repeat that phrase again first.
What's the go of come, what's the go of that? Come on, give it to us.
Say again.
What's the go of that?
What's the go of that?
No. Pretty close, okay. This inquisitiveness found many outlets in the various outdoor activities that went on in the estate, particularly as his father worked at its continual improvement through numerous projects. Undoubtedly, his father's patient, informal tutoring was an abiding influence. For example, his mother wrote about him, aged 2½, he has great works with doors, locks, keys, etc., and show me how it does is never out of his mouth. He investigates the hidden course of streams and bell wires, and he drags Papa all over to show him the holes where the wires go through. Or, as his nanny relates about a new tin plate, it was a bright sunny day, he held it to the sun, and the reflection went round and round the room. He said, "It is the sun, Papa, I got it in with a tin plate." His Papa told him when he was a little older he would let him see the moon and stars, and so he did. By his own later testimony, James felt very deeply the loss of his mother to cancer when he was 8. Undoubtedly, one effect of her death was to draw James and his father even closer together, a bond of love and duty that defined much of Maxwell's early character. A local tutor was hired to continue James's education, but this was completely unsatisfactory. The tutor tried unsuccessfully to obtain his pupil's attention and obedience through various physical forms of coercion. We may surmise that the harassment was not all one way. A drawing by James's cousin, Jemima Weberburn, shows James paddling his floating wash tub away from the unflatteringly portrayed tutor, who is vainly trying to catch him. Well, this regime continued for 2 years until James's aunt, Jane Kay, on a visit to Glenlair, realized what was going on. The tutor was dismissed, and in November 1841, Maxwell was sent to the Edinburgh Academy, lodging with his father's widowed sister, Mrs. Wedderburn, at 31 Harriet Row. The Edinburgh Academy had been founded in 1824 by a group including Sir Walter Scott, the author of, for example, Ivanhoe, to teach, quote, all the branches of study which are essential to the education of a young gentleman, end quote. It was certainly one of the most successful Scottish schools of its day, with an emphasis on Latin, Greek, and mathematics. By all accounts, however, the science teaching was extremely weak. The star pupils seemed to know more than their teachers, and this was perhaps partly as a result of the philosophical society that the pupils formed to educate themselves. Maxwell himself was really quite a misfit during his early years in the academy. He suffered a serious ragging when he arrived on the first day wearing rather original clothing designed by his father. And his rustic Galwegian accent and stutter marked him out, and he early acquired the nickname Dafty. Perhaps this was in reference to his quirky humor, which is evident in later letters and postcards, which must really have rendered much of his conversation unintelligible to boys of slower wit. After 2 years, Maxwell had shown rather indifferent scholastic performance, but began then to show his mettle. He gained some friends. Lewis Campbell, the future professor of classics at St. Andrews University, and his eventual biographer, moved in a few doors away, 27, Harriet wrote. P.G. Tate, the future professor of natural philosophy at Edinburgh University, struck up with Maxwell a lifetime's friendship, and the pair worked together through mathematical problems which they referred to as propositions, or props for short. He discovered for himself the perfect geometrical figures. He invented a method for drawing ovals, which are a kind of mathematical figures slightly more complicated than ellipses, and through his father's influence at the Edinburgh Royal Society saw the work published under the sponsorship of Professor James Forbes of Edinburgh University. And in 1847, at age 16, Maxwell himself entered Edinburgh University. There, for 3 years, he would learn not only physics under Forbes' lecturing and also informally participating in the laboratory, but also the dominant theme of Edinburgh's course, which was philosophy. In this latter subject, the most powerful influence seems to have been the common sense philosopher Sir William Hamilton, professor of logic and metaphysics, by the way, not to be confused with the Irish mathematician William Rowan Hamilton, whose name is perpetuated in the Hamiltonian dynamics, which we had a few discussions about yesterday. By all accounts, students at Edinburgh had substantial liberty for leisure or private study. And from his letters to Campbell, we can tell that Maxwell took advantage of both. So he writes, "So I get up and see what time of day it is and what field works are to be done. Then I catch the pony and bring up the water barrel. Then I take the dogs out. Then I look round the garden for fruit and seeds and paddle about till breakfast time." That's all before breakfast. After that, I take up Cicero and I see if I can understand him. And if so, I read until I stick. If not, I set to Xenophon or Herodotus. Then I do props, chiefly on rolling curves. After props come optics, and principally polarized light. Do you remember our visit to Mr. Nicol? I've got plenty of unannealed glass of different shapes. Those of you who are physicists realize that the Nicol prism is still remembered as a mechanism for polarizing light. This industry and the breadth of this education are a critical part of Maxwell's greatness, especially his philosophical sophistication. Maxwell was by no means the narrow scientific technician portrayed in many images of modern scientists, nor was he the shallow generalist produced by much modern liberal arts education today. When he read Xenophon, Herodotus, or Cicero, it was in the original languages. Maxwell stayed longer than some of his contemporaries at Edinburgh. Perhaps this was because it took those 3 years for his father to reconcile himself to James's desire for a scientific career rather than a legal career. But in 1850, Maxwell departed Scotland for the foremost British institution of scientific education, Cambridge University. Maxwell started his Cambridge career at the College of Peterhouse. That's the oldest college. Of course, as was explained yesterday, Cambridge University had and still has a collegiate system of living and tutoring in which there is substantial independence for individual college foundations, which in many cases date back many centuries, while exams and lectures are centralized in the university as a whole. Despite substantial breadth of studies in classics and beyond, the chief objective of ambitious undergraduates was to become a wrangler. That is to say, to obtain a first-class honors degree in the mathematical tripos. Tripos means examination series. It's remarkable how dominant mathematics was in the educational system of the time, but it should be remembered that Newton himself was Lucasian professor of mathematics in his day, and Stephen Hawking is today, although maybe has he retired yet? Just retired, was until recently. Mathematics at Cambridge for Maxwell encompassed all of physics as well. Now, actually, Maxwell soon moved from Peterhouse to Trinity College for competitive reasons. His contemporary, E.J. Ralph, at Peterhouse was his equal in mathematics, and so a clearer field to a subsequent college fellowship after the Tritos was advisable. There was no such formidable competition at Trinity College. Maxwell seems to have been somewhat restless in the way that he settled to the Cambridge regimen. Early on, he wrote to his father on one occasion as follows: "Man requires more. He finds X and Y innutritious, Greek and Latin indigestible, and undergrads nauseous. He starves while being crammed. He wants man's meat, not college pudding. Is truth nowhere but in mathematics? Must nature as well as revelation be examined through canonical spectacles by the dark lantern of tradition and measured out by the unlearned, by the learned to the unlearned, all second hand?" So what Maxwell seems to be complaining about here is the emphasis on technical mastery, especially of mathematics, which was characteristic of the Cambridge education. But also, I think, he's feeling intellectually constrained by the tradition that he's required to study. And referring to the scriptural canon, he seems to take for granted that revelation, meaning God's revelation to man, is to be examined by reference to the Bible. But he's questioning whether tradition's directed, dark lantern attention is the right approach to the study of nature. We see here in the youthful Maxwell his wrestling with the balance between discipline and innovation. He longs to progress past the traditional studies and to propound new propositions. At the same time, he doesn't discount the value of traditional study, because he immediately goes on to say, "I am also persuaded that the study of X and Y is to men an essential for the preparation of the intelligent study of the material universe. That few will grind up these subjects without the help of rules, the awe of authority, and a continued abstinence from unripe realities." And then Maxwell launches into a rambling philosophical justification of academic study in the context of this declaration: "I believe with the Westminster divines and their predecessors ad infinitum that man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever." This is, of course, the keystone statement of the Presbyterian statement of faith, the Westminster Confession. Maxwell's intellectual understanding of his Christian faith and of science grew rapidly during his Cambridge years. He joined the Apostles, an exclusive debating society of the intellectual elite, where through his essays he sought to work out this understanding. 18 months into his Cambridge education, Maxwell gives us an insight into his views of Christianity and academic research in a letter to his friend Lewis Campbell. And I'm going to give you an extensive quotation from this. "Now my great plan, which was conceived of old, is to let nothing be willfully left unexamined. Nothing is to be holy ground, consecrated to stationary faith, whether positive or negative. All fallow land is to be ploughed up, and a regular system of rotation followed. Never hide anything, be it weed or no, nor seem to wish it hidden. Again, I assert the right of trespass on any plot of holy ground which any man has set apart. Now I am convinced that no one but a Christian can actually purge his land of these holy spots. I do not say that no one has some, but that no Christians have such enclosed places of this sort. Many have a great deal, and everyone has some. But there are extensive and important tracts of the territory of the scoffer, the pantheist, the quietist, formalist, dogmatist, sensualist, and the rest, which are openly and solemnly tabooed. Christianity, that is, the religion of the Bible, is the only scheme or form of belief which disavows any possessions on such a tenure. Here alone all is free. You may fly to the ends of the world and find no God but the author of salvation. You may search the scriptures and not find a text to stop you in your explorations. The Old Testament and the Mosaic Law and Judaism are commonly supposed to be tabooed by the Orthodox. Skeptics pretend to have read them and have found certain witty objections, which too many of the Orthodox, unread, admit, and shut up the subject as haunted. But a candle is coming to drive out all ghosts and bugbears. Let us follow the light. Now, the reason for including so extensive, but still actually incomplete, a quotation here is in part that one of Maxwell's later biographers, Tolstoy, who is clearly someone with little sympathy for religion, grossly misinterprets this letter. He calls Maxwell's conviction that only a Christian can purge his land of these holy spots, these unexamined regions, these locked up bugbears. Tolstoy calls this a profession of faith which it seems is going to be willfully left unexamined. Maxwell's religious convictions were clearly so deeply embedded that he was unconscious of the inconsistency. That's what Tolstoy says. But I would argue that this biographer is plainly assuming from his own materialist position that religious convictions cannot be held once they are examined. I mean, that's really the assumption that Tolstoy is making. And that therefore, Maxwell, if he claims he's going to examine those presuppositions and yet still maintains them, must be bound to be inconsistent. But that's the exact opposite of a more direct reading of Maxwell's statements. Maxwell believes that Christianity is true, and that it is indeed the one true scheme, as he calls it, and that because of that status, it can afford to open itself to the most complete examination, or even of the most sensitive and tabooed spots, in a way that no other system of belief can. Now, of course, the extent to which Maxwell did in fact plough up his Christian beliefs and put them to the intellectual test can be judged only incompletely from his writings. But there's plenty of evidence, especially from his undergraduate days, that he did deeply examine his faith. Certainly his knowledge of the Bible was remarkable, and so his confidence in the Scriptures, as he expresses it, was not based on ignorance by any means. In the summer of his third year, Maxwell spent some time at the Suffolk home of the Reverend C.B. Taylor, the uncle of a classmate, G.W.H. Taylor. The family impressed Maxwell, himself an only child, who later said that it gave him a glimpse of the love of God, albeit in a well-regulated family in which there was plenty of willing obedience but little diligence, much mutual trust but little self-reliance. He felt ill while he was there. The illness was subsequently attributed to overwork, and he was nursed for 2 weeks by the minister and his wife. As his classmate later recounted concerning this experience, it was then that my uncle's conversation seemed to make such a deep impression on his mind. He had always been a regular attendant at the services of God's house, although he had thought and read much on religious subjects. But at this time, as it appears from his own account of the matter, his religious views were greatly deepened and strengthened. On his return to Cambridge, Maxwell writes to his recent host a chatty and affectionate letter, including the following testimony. I have the capacity of being more wicked than any example that man could set me. And if I escape, it is only by God's grace, helping me to get rid of myself, partially in science, more completely in society, but not perfectly, except by committing myself to God. This is, of course, a thoroughly orthodox Christian affirmation of dependence on God's grace for salvation from sin. But notice how Maxwell identifies his science as part of God's plan for his salvation. We can only speculate about what thoughts along these lines he and the Reverend Taylor had discussed during the days of his recuperation. Despite the extreme-sounding confession, Maxwell was, by habit, a very kindly person, a contemporary recounts how, when he was unable to read because of eye strain, Maxwell helped him and often gave up an hour of his recreation time to read out to me some of the bookwork I wanted to get over. Maxwell was strongly influenced by Frederick Denison Morris, a former apostle and the founder of the Christian Socialist movement. Morris became a cause célèbre in 1853 by being deposed from his position at King's College London for heresy, which, by the way, was to do with the meaning of the word eternal and whether religion must of necessity be obvious to the unlearned as well as to the learned. Rather abstruse matters. Maxwell didn't adopt Maurice's theological positions as a whole, but he did become convinced of one of Maurice's key tenets, which was that the dehumanization of the working class in an industrializing society was to be prevented by a cooperative approach in which workers were given greater influence through education. Maurice and his friends set up working men's colleges, and Maxwell, seeing this as a vital Christian service, taught working men's classes weekly until at least 1866. So it was thus, as a young man of remarkable commitments, that Maxwell passed his final exam as the second wrangler, ceding the first place to his friend Ralph, but sharing with him in the prestigious Smith Prize. The year 1855 brought appointment to a fellowship at Trinity College. It also brought the cares of nursing his father through illness, though John was to die the following year, and at its end, the publication that launched Maxwell's electromagnetic researches on Faraday's lines of force. This paper, by drawing extensive mathematical analogies to hydrodynamics, helped to make respectable Faraday's field approach to electricity and showed how to express magnetic induction in differential form that was later to prove key to the electromagnetic waves and indeed all of field theory. His fellowship at Trinity was brief, however, because on the 30th of April, 1856, Maxwell heard from his sponsor, Professor Forbes, that he was appointed Professor of Natural Philosophy at Marischal College, Aberdeen. One of the most important of Maxwell's experiences at Aberdeen, where his research was dominated by Saturn's rings, must have been meeting and eventually marrying Catherine Mary Dewar, the principal's daughter. Not much is known about Catherine herself, and Maxwell's later biographers conclude from the reticence of Campbell that she was not well liked by Maxwell's friends. However, James' relations with Catherine give some useful insights into his spiritual life. Campbell gives us a few extracts from letters during the last few months of their engagement, despite protesting his lack of skill in scriptural exposition, Maxwell writes very insightful explanations of passages from Galatians, Ephesians, and Philippians that are almost miniature sermons. He refers to a Sunday school class that he had taught while visiting Lewis Campbell. And plainly, Catherine and James's common Christian faith was an important bond from the beginning of their marriage and even before. Tolstoy, from his materialist viewpoint, his later biographer I'm referring to, is unable to understand that such spiritual discourse might be a natural aspect of the continuing relationship of Christian man and wife. But it clearly was for Maxwell. Actually, Tolstoy makes the most remarkably ignorant remarks about Christians in general in this Maxwell biography. It's a very entertaining biography that he writes, but he has no insight into Maxwell's religious beliefs whatsoever. Another aspect of Maxwell's character that is revealed in his marriage is the kindness and compassion with which he nursed his wife through frequent indispositions. By the sound of it, she was something of a hypochondriac. But James was ever the caring husband and frequently sat up all night to tend her, even during his own final illness. She in turn nursed him through a dangerous attack of smallpox and later participated in some of his experiments on color vision and on the measurement of the temperature dependence of gas viscosity. Apparently she acted as the coal stoker for the higher temperatures that he required. In 1860, the two Aberdeen colleges were merged, and despite his seniority, Maxwell was out of a job. This was all to the good, though, because he was almost immediately appointed to the chair at King's College, London, where he remained until 1865, 5 years. In the inaugural lecture, which new professors traditionally gave, Maxwell discourses on the various philosophical aspects of science. For example, whether fundamental truths of physics are to be regarded as mere facts discovered by experiment or as necessary truths which the mind must acknowledge as soon as its attention has been directed to them. Actually, on balance, Maxwell implies the latter, that they are necessary truths. But as with much of his philosophical writing, he's not really clear about it. He also refers to an idea that he would later develop in much more detail. Quote, that every atom of creation is unfathomable in its perfection. And I want to take this point slightly out of order and quote from the version of this idea that Maxwell eventually published in the journal Nature and elsewhere in 1873, where from astronomical observations of the characteristic wavelengths of radiation from atoms, he concludes, we are thus assured that molecules of the same nature as those of our hydrogen exist in those distant regions, or at least did exist when the light was emitted. Each molecule, therefore, throughout the universe, bears impressed upon it the stamp of a metric system as distinctly as does the meter of the archives at Paris or the double royal cubit of the temples of Karnak. None of the processes of nature, since the time when nature began, have produced the slightest difference in the properties of any molecule. We are therefore unable to ascribe either the existence of the molecules or the identity of their properties to the operation of any of the causes which we call natural. On the other hand, the exact equality of each molecule to all the others of the same kind it gives it, as Sir John Herschel has well said, the essential character of a manufactured article, and precludes the idea of it being eternal and self-existent. Thus we have been led along a strictly scientific path very near to the point at which science must stop. This is a somewhat unfamiliar and actually a rather inverted form of the argument from design. Maxwell is saying that molecules are perfectly identical to one another, and this suggests that they are, as it were, manufactured according to an intelligent plan. Maxwell explained himself in more detail later in a letter. What I thought of was not so much that uniformity of result, which is due to uniformity in the process of formation, as a uniformity intended and accomplished by the same wisdom and power of which uniformity, accuracy, symmetry, consistency, and continuity of plan are important attributes. This wasn't an original idea of Maxwell's, and he gives the original Herschel reference dated 1851. But it's interesting to realize that Darwin's Origin of Species was first published in 1859, the year before Maxwell's first oblique reference to molecular perfection. Clearly, he was well aware of the extent to which the fashionable liberal academics' argument for design, based on the perfection of biological adaptation, was undermined by discoveries pointing to evolution. And though Maxwell was by no means a theological liberal, he accepted the revelation of God through Jesus Christ, he's pointing to a different perfection in creation, one which he emphasizes cannot be attributed to evolutionary adaptation. It's an intriguing thought. Not that actually Maxwell was strictly correct that atoms are immutable, whether in terms of atomic reactions or in terms of nuclear reactions, which is my field. But his approach is more to appreciate the ordered uniformity rather than the peculiarity and complexity of nature as signs of the creator. In other words, when you look at biology, you see very great complexity and adaptation, and the argument of the day, of course, was to point to that as a evidence for the creator. Maxwell's really turning that on its head. He's saying, no, it's the simplicity and uniformity that are signs of the creator's hand. But beyond that, Maxwell's modest claims for the idea are, in my mind, a model for how a scientist could and perhaps should draw attention to the aspects of his or her science that points to matters beyond his scientific competence. Maxwell's breadth of appreciation of Christianity grew still further during his time in London. To his background of Presbyterianism in the Scottish Church of his father's tradition and the Anglicanism of his mother in Cambridge, he added an experience of the Baptists. So in a letter to Reverend C.V. Taylor, he criticizes obtuse sermons that he'd heard at Cambridge, and he goes on, "There is in this street a Baptist who knows his Bible and preaches as near it as he can, and does what he can to let the statements in the Bible be understood by his hearers. We generally go to him when in London, though we believe ourselves baptized already." So this confession of Maxwell's willingness to go where he feels the gospel is clearly preached actually apparently embarrasses Lewis Campbell, who speculates, somewhat gratuitously I think, that the habit was a concession to Mrs. Maxwell's, quote, simple Presbyterian experience. This seems a very unlikely explanation. The tone of Maxwell's remarks leaves little doubt that his only awkwardness about attending this Baptist chapel arose from the doctrinal differences concerning the validity of infant baptism. That Maxwell didn't allow this to discourage him is another indication that in spiritual matters he followed his conscience, his own conscience, above all. In 1865, Maxwell retired from his London position. It had been an extremely productive tenure, seeing much of his experimental work on gases to its fruition and the publication of his On the Physical Lines of Force in 3 parts from 1861 to 1862, including the displacement current and predicting electromagnetic waves traveling at the speed of light. And his equations were published in 1865. But he wanted to complete the building of the house at Glenlair as a sacred trust to his father. His independent wealth permitted him to resign from the fairly heavy burdens of teaching and devote his time to the estate, to some continental travel, to an extensive correspondence, and to writing his masterly treatise on electricity and magnetism. The house was finished in 1867, but this was just one aspect of being laird of the estate. Other aspects that were pursued assiduously by both James and his father before him were the nightly reading of the Bible for the servants and an almost proprietorial sponsorship of the church at Corsock, the nearby village. Here, by the way, is the front page of his famous book, The Treatise on Electricity and Magnetism. It was written while he was retired at Glenlair, published in 1873. For those of you who are interested in the technical aspects of it, Maxwell worked almost entirely in Cartesian coordinates, writing out each coordinate by itself. He didn't, of course, have vector notation. He had the early beginnings of vector notation, which were in those days were quaternions, which are a very complicated approach to vectors. And if you look at this side, you can see some of his working. He also, by the way, introduced what's called the Maxwell demon at this time that he was in Glenlair. So by all means, it was actually still quite a productive time. His correspondence during that time was most notably with William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, and his school friend P.G. Tate. Thomson and Tate had published their textbook, Treatise on Natural Philosophy, in 1867, and were henceforth referred to in their letters as T and T prime. By a later notational coincidence, in a work of Tate's, Maxwell's initials appeared in the equation JCM, James Clerk Maxwell, JCM equals dp by dt. And hence, thereafter, in the insider language of their abbreviated correspondence, often on postcards, this is an example of one such postcard, Maxwell became dp by dt. You probably can't read it, it's just down in this corner, dp by dt. Here's a t and a t prime, t and t prime. Another running gag, based on the coincidence that the archbishops of York and Canterbury at that time were also called Thompson and Tate, transformed t and t prime into the archiepiscopal pair. So a quicksilver wit was characteristic of Maxwell's correspondence, showing his fertility of imagination and convoluted, often poetic sense of humor. The time at Glenlair enabled Maxwell to put in order and publish his electrodynamic theories in their most comprehensive form. It also saw the introduction of his famous demon, but that retirement came to an end eventually when Maxwell was persuaded to accept in 1871 the newly created Cavendish Professorship of Experimental Physics at Cambridge. By the way, only after Thomson and Helmholtz had already turned it down, so he was the third choice. The job of Cavendish Professor of Physics was, for the first few years at least, predominantly administrative. The Duke of Devonshire's bequest funded the building of the lab, but Maxwell had to actually manage the construction himself. Probably his Glenlair experience was an ideal background for this task. Certainly, his conscientious attention made it a great success, and his organizational abilities more than made up for his weakness as a lecturer. Perhaps he felt it a duty of the position also to spend much of his time on editing the scientific papers of Henry Cavendish, which was itself a major work of scientific and historical scholarship that Maxwell undertook. Maxwell had become a public figure, even though his science was greatly underappreciated. And so it was not surprising that he was consulted, for example, by the Bishop of Gloucester and Bristol, about Maxwell's ideas relating his faith and science. So the bishop is wondering whether the creation of the sun after the creation of light in Genesis 1 can be harmonized by regarding the latter as referring to primal vibrations, in other words, the ether. And Maxwell replies to this rather naive question with politeness and I think great wisdom. He says, there is a statement printed in most commentaries that the fact of light being created before the sun, shouldn't be after the sun, is in striking agreements with the last results of science. Before the sun is in striking agreement with the last results of science. I have often wished to ascertain the date of the original appearance of this statement, as this would be the only way of finding out what last result of science it referred to. It is certainly older than the time when any notions of the undulatory theory became prevalent. If it were necessary to provide an interpretation of the text in accordance with the science of 1876, which may not agree with that of 1896, it would be very tempting to say that the light of the first day means the all-embracing ether. But I cannot suppose that this was the very idea meant to be conveyed by the original author to those for whom he was writing. But I should be very sorry if an interpretation founded on a most conjectural scientific hypothesis were to get fastened to the text in Genesis. The rate of change of scientific hypothesis is naturally much more rapid than that of biblical interpretation, so that if an interpretation is founded on such an hypothesis, it may help to keep the hypothesis above ground long after it ought to be buried and forgotten. At the same time, I think that each individual man should do all he can to impress his own mind with the extent, the order, and the unity of the universe, and should carry these ideas with him as he reads such passages as the first chapter of the Epistle to the Colossians. So you like put on Colossians page 182, gives these little references. Just as enlarged conceptions of the extent and unity of the world may be of service to us in reading Psalm 8, Hebrews 2:6, etc. So in this way, Maxwell, rather penetratingly, I think, criticizes the misuse of partial scientific knowledge to interpret Scripture, let alone to shore up faith by supposed harmonization with the latest science. He has no need of scientific proofs of Christianity. Instead, his expressed concern is that ill-judged linking of specific scientific theories with religion will be an impediment to the growth of science. And his emphasis in relating science and faith is in science's enhancement of our wonder at the glory of creation. That's certainly a much more enduring theme than the ether, which of course, as many of you realize, is a kind of dramatic irony in this letter, which was that the ether was in fact discarded, not exactly in 1896, 20 years after Maxwell was writing, but pretty soon thereafter. So Maxwell was really prescient in his refusal to identify that. Very, very interesting for me. Well, I must come to the end. In his 6th year as Cavendish professor, the first symptoms began of his last long and painful battle with abdominal cancer. He bore it without complaint. His kindness never soured, his faith never dimmed. The minister who regularly visited him in his last weeks was astonished at his lucidity and the immense power and scope of his memory. But he comments more particularly, his illness drew out the whole heart and soul and spirit of the man. His firm and undoubting faith in the Incarnation and all its results, and in the full sufficiency of the atonement, in the works of the Holy Spirit. He had gauged and fathomed all the schemes and systems of philosophy, and had found them utterly empty and unsatisfying. Unworkable was his own word about them. And he turned in simple faith to the gospel of the Saviour. As death approached, Maxwell told a Cambridge colleague, "I have been thinking how very gently I have been dealt with. I have never had a violent shaft all my life. The only desire which I can have is, like David, to serve my own generation by the will of God, and then fall asleep." Fall asleep he did on November the 5th, 1879. And after services of remembrance at Cambridge, was buried in the churchyard of Hartley, near his beloved Glenware. But his scientific work has proven enduring, far beyond merely serving his generation, and marking him as a genius of the first rank, one formed and sustained in thought and life and death by the Christian faith. Thank you very much.
Absolutely tremendous. Thank you very much, Ian. Over to you for questions.
And comments, because what do we learn about the physics of faith? I'm sure there are many of you who have thoughts, impressions, reactions, and I'd love to hear those as well.
Great, yeah. I was amused that he moved to Trinity because Trinity was less competitive.
Remarkable, isn't it? Remarkable.
Yeah,
Very
that
particular.
hurts as a Trinity man.
René, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a question
Comment.
about these fundamental truths of physics. And so his inaugural address at King's, and there you quote him as saying that, so the question is, are these fundamental principles, are they to be discerned through empirical inquiry, or are they self-evident truths? And your comment was, well, he thought that they were self-evident truths.
He leant towards the idea that they were self-evident truths, but again, he's not terribly clear about it, and he leaves it to open a little bit.
So then my question is, could you say what the nature is of those fundamental principles of physics? Are they principles like every event has a cause? Are they of that general nature, or are they much more specific?
I think that the intention was to think of them as more specific, more directly. The question was, could the laws of physics be different from what they are? Is the kind of question that he and others were asking, and was asked from there afterwards, and he leant towards the view that that the laws of physics were probably, had to be the way they were for sort of logical reasons. Arthur Eddington was followed up much in the same lines. Arthur Eddington was another great British scientist and Christian. He was a Quaker, actually. Eddington made himself infamous within scientific circles in the first half of the 20th century by purporting to be able to derive, for example, the fine structure constant from purely logical mathematical processes. And he came out with an exact value of it, which was very close to the experimental value, although eventually was shown to be not equal to, it was shown not to be equal to 1 over 137. It's not exactly. Certainly Arthur Eddington's view, which was very strongly that, much more strongly than Maxwell, that the fundamental laws of physics were in a certain sense logically demanded by logic. So in Maxwell's case, I think the question was less clear. Certainly Maxwell's position was less clear, although he tended to lean in that direction. Of course, I think these days it's much more fashionable to take a view of the contingency rather than the necessity of the laws of physics. Certainly my view is that the laws of physics could be different. And when we talk about, for example, fine-tuning, we imagine the possibility that the parameters of the laws of nature could be different from what they are. We say that if they were, then, for example, the universe would be very different. Maybe we wouldn't have carbon life forms and so on and so forth. So, but that's what it's all surrounding. Yeah.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. Yes. Thank you, Catherine.
What do you suppose Maxwell meant by the statement, "I have never had a violent shove all my life"? This is someone who lost his mother at the tender age of 8. This is someone who got kicked out of St Andrews when the colleges merged. It doesn't strike me that it was an entirely easy existence.
That's a very, very insightful. Did everyone hear that? Did everyone hear that? Catherine is commenting, what could have Maxwell possibly have meant when he said, "I haven't had a violent shove all my life"? Because after all, his mother died when he was 8. He lost his job in Aberdeen and so on and so forth. So clearly things happened to him that were moderately unpleasant. It's a fair comment, very, very good comment. I would only suppose. First of all, I mean, I think it was a comment from the heart. He died thankfully. I mean, here he was. He's actually suffered from cancer for nearly 2 years, gradually getting worse. So he died a miserable death. Okay, and yet practically on his deathbed, he makes this statement. It's very remarkable, I think. And he was a man whose faith somehow led him to this life of thanksgiving. So he saw the bright side of things, and he didn't dwell on the matters where he clearly had suffered. So I think pointing that out is very nice. Thank you. Yes, but I don't have any kind of great explanation of what he meant. I just presume that he lived this life of thankfulness.
Yes. More questions?
Yeah.
Do we have any more information about what actually he experienced when he was staying with his friend's uncle? Did he have a kind of St. Paul experience, or was it something else?
He clearly did have some kind of deep, personal, transformative spiritual experience. What exactly that was, we don't know. And the parts that I quoted are not the entirety of Lewis Campbell's explanation of what went on. But undoubtedly, Maxwell came to a new level of commitment in his Christian faith. As was explained, I mean, he never rebelled, he never sort of rejected his Christianity. He had, at Cambridge, said that he was going to examine it, leave no stone unturned, plow up the entire thing and subject it to a serious critical intellectual scrutiny. But as far as we know, he never became disenchanted with Christianity, which clearly he had literally learned at his mother's knee. But during that time in Suffolk, he had some kind of transformative experience which led him to a much deeper commitment to Christ. And was this a conversion? I think probably to call it a conversion would be too strong a statement, since he wasn't being converted from any kind of unbelieving state. But he certainly had a remarkable experience. Clearly, this was in part assisted or ministered through Reverend Taylor, and clearly it was something that changed Maxwell's life, and the fact that he thereafter wrote several letters back, to his friend's father, to the Reverend Taylor, is an important one. I've tried to show you, the insight into what he saw. As I mentioned, as I quoted, Maxwell himself was impressed by the family in a kind of ambivalent way, because he had grown up as an only child, and so going into the bosom of this family that has several children, what he found was a great camaraderie, a great friendship and fellowship, a great love that knit this family together. Maxwell himself had really just had himself and his father since he was 8 years old, and fighting with the tutor and so on and so forth. So it was clearly just seeing the sort of Christian love, as Maxwell saw it, within the family was an important experience to him. But as he also sort of says in a kind of backhanded way, well, yeah, there was that love, there was that mutual respect, but there wasn't a lot of independence, for example, he said. So he could see that there was a flip side to being part of a strong family bond, that it didn't sort of breed kind of independence and industry and so on and so forth, which he felt that perhaps he had developed from his own youth. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a physicist, but do you see after that event, does his interests in physics, do they change direction at all? Or does it affect his physics?
I don't think there's any way to tell whether that affected his physics. I certainly know of none. Actually, in respect of his physics, much of the material here comes from a very extensive 2-volume biography that was written by Lewis Campbell. Lewis Campbell was a classicist, professor of classics. Actually, Campbell wrote most of the first volume. The second volume is mostly written by Garnett. It's Campbell and Garnett are the authors of the biography. William Garnett was a scientist whose name no one remembers other than that he was the biographer of Maxwell. And really, much of the second volume spends time trying to explain Maxwell's science. Actually, it's a very unsatisfactory volume in that Garnett's understanding of Maxwell's science was clearly rather poor. Actually, it reflects the fact that Maxwell's science was pretty poorly understood by his contemporaries almost across the board. So although he was very highly respected by people like Kelvin and Tate and so forth, who did understand his science, by and large, people didn't understand how important Maxwell's discoveries were, how important the equations were, how important the kinetic theory of gases was, and so forth. So he was largely misunderstood. So people I think, of the caliber of Garnett realized that, Thomson and Tate and others highly respected Maxwell, and so they thought, well, he must, this must be important, but they didn't really get it. But back to the question, I really don't know of a way that you'd be able to tell directly whether his conversion or his deep experience that he had with Taylor in Suffolk affected that. What you can see in much of what Maxwell says is the way that he speaks about the unity, the consistency, and so forth of creation. And what you see is that for Maxwell, that kind of, in a certain sense, mathematical elegance was not only part of his scientific motivation and interest, but it was also, in a certain sense, part of his religious motivation and interest. So for Maxwell, that uniformity and elegance, that consistency of the universe, pointed him, or in his mind was reflective of the care of the Creator. So I think that in that sense, Maxwell's determination to bring that elegance to his science was one important relationship between his science and his faith. But maybe there are people with other questions or other comments.
No, actually, this is a question more for history of science. But do you know if from Maxwell times until nowadays exists someone who combines so sincerely and so deeply physics and with faith?
Is there an equivalent of the question?
Okay, is there,
in terms of physics and faith?
So is there some other example of a person who combines these so closely? I've alluded already to Arthur Eddington. He is certainly someone that one might point to in this respect. But therein lies an interesting question. Maxwell, we have ways, as I've explained, of understanding Maxwell's faith rather well. We have examples of letters that he wrote. We have example of the commentary of his very close friends, and so forth. And so Maxwell is a splendid case study where we can actually deeply probe his religious beliefs as well as his scientific beliefs. Predominantly in the 20th century, and even to a certain extent in the late 19th century, it became less frequently, less the habit for people to speak about their religious faith so directly, to write about it, to have it be part of their autobiographies. And so part of the secularization that I spoke of yesterday, this part of the secularization of the academy, was to shy away from scientists like Maxwell speaking out publicly about matters of religious faith. So certainly by the 20th century it became rather unusual for scientists to speak of their faith. And so actually, certainly in the 20th century, it's much harder than it was in the 19th century to find people, great scientists, for whom one can find out, what their religious commitments were and so forth. Arthur Eddington is a case where one can, because Arthur Eddington, in addition to his direct sort of technical physics work, which was mostly associated with the structure of stars and with the structure of galaxies, as well as he became the great English language exponent of general relativity. In addition, he wrote several books of basically religious and scientific philosophy. So he basically wrote about his faith, how he understood the relationship between science and faith. And another scientist of the same era, Sir James Jeans, similarly wrote. Actually, those two were taken to task by many of the philosophers and scientists of their age, because many of the now professionalized philosophers and scientists rather resented the fact that these two scientists would cross over and do scholarship, publish books and so forth that talked about questions of philosophy, because the philosophers thought that they were really a little bit naive and were treading over ground that the philosophers themselves had plowed up and decided the questions long before. Maybe some of us still do the same thing, so I'll wait for Tim to straighten me out later on today. But anyway, so the answer is there are examples. Actually, William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, that I spoke about, who was one of Maxwell's
correspondents and close friends, was himself a very sincere Christian, but the resources to understand Kelvin's Christianity are not as great as those for Maxwell. There aren't so many extant letters that speak about this and so forth. But he was undoubtedly a convinced Christian and did from time to time speak about such matters. Yeah, very good question. Thank you.
Yeah. Right.
I just wanted to add a few names from our times of people who are deeply and publicly committed to their faiths, and all of them Nobel Prize winners. One of the first one, his name escapes me, he's the inventor of the laser, somebody remind me.
Charles Towns.
Charles Towns. The other one is William Phillips, or Bill Phillips as he is known around, and the third one is Abdus Salam that I mentioned yesterday. All three of them physicists, Nobel Prize winners, and publicly committed to their faiths.
Yes. I mean, someone I was thinking of was Ernest Walton, who was the atom splitter, Cockcroft Walton, and who was chairman of the Methodist Conference in Ireland. You know, so I mean, one can think of. I think one can actually think of plenty of examples as soon as one. I mean, some of the eminence of Maxwell. I mean, there's no one quite to compare. I mean, Maxwell, I think, ranks with Einstein and Newton as one of the, well for me, anyway, one of the three great physicists. Yeah.
So in the end, we have to listen to the newspaper reporters because they know best.
Could you develop that question, or is it?
I feel that this attitude of not speaking about one's faith comes from the attacks in the media.
Yeah, where does it come from? I think it comes in part from the professionalization and the separation of the disciplines. So as I say, it's not just the case in matters of science and religion, it's the case in all across the academy that since the time of the 1800s, we've made a transition to the case where, you know, we're not only physicists, but we're a particular type of physicist. We're plasma physicists, or we're astrophysicists, or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of specialization, so the idea of a Renaissance thinker is very unusual these days. So that's an important influence. I think that in terms of offering, you know, Christian testimony or declaring one's religious allegiances, you know, I think part of this is a function of individual choice or individual conviction. You know, at MIT, I think of MIT as being the high temple of science and technology in the US, at any rate. Students come to MIT, Christian students come to MIT, expecting it to be utterly secular and atheistic. And they're really quite surprised many times to find that there are a substantial number of religious believers, Christians, and probably others that I don't know, at MIT. And so it is the case that within even so modern and secularized an institution as MIT that never had any religious foundation or anything like that. In fact, Christianity is alive and well and represented on the faculty. I was department head of nuclear science and engineering at MIT for 6 years. And the department heads of the engineering school meet in the engineering council on a regular basis, and there's a total of about 12 of them meet in the room with the dean. And one of the remarkable observations was that while I was there, I know for a fact that 3 of those department heads were serious committed Christians. Okay, so that's a quarter. You know, is that representative of MIT as a whole? I don't know, maybe not. But yet, what it does show is that those people who imply or think that religion is somehow dead in academia, certainly that's not true, even of so secular and technological an institution as MIT. So is it the fault of the media? Maybe it is to some extent. Undoubtedly the media is sometimes aggressive against people of religious faith. But maybe we also have to get our act together and get up and say what we think.
Dennis has a comment.
Yeah, just to follow up on that comment, I mean, just to, Cambridge, if this Cambridge is anything like your Cambridge, then, I mean, it's quite noticeable here in Cambridge that, committed believers are generally in the science faculties and the science departments. There are many fewer, in the humanities and the arts, so, and for whatever reason, but it's exactly the reverse of the public perception. So it sort of fits a little bit with what you're saying, I think, in MIT.
That's a very good point. It's certainly my own personal observations would confirm that very often it is that religious Christian believers are not underrepresented in the sciences, they're overrepresented in the sciences in comparison with other disciplines. And this is actually borne out by sociological studies of the prevalence of religiosity amongst faculty, that factor of enhancement was very dramatic from the 60s through the 90s and so forth. There's a book that I saw is on the book stand. I'll give a little bit of a push to someone else's book. Of course, if there are any of my books, you should rush out and buy them. But the book I'm referring to is a book by Elaine Eklund, who's a sociologist at Rice University. And she's just completed a major study of religiosity amongst scientists, actually in high prestige universities in the US. And the statistics aren't quite as dramatic as they used to be, but it's still the case that you can't see any substantial deficit of religious faith amongst the sciences compared to the other disciplines.
Yeah, we should have a copy of that. If it's not there now, I'll make sure we get one on the bookstore.
Yeah. More questions?
Yeah.
Comments?
Yes.
Well, I already had a turn, but I was interested in what this pastor that was talking with Maxwell during his last months or during the last weeks of his life, and then he says that Maxwell gorged and fathomed all the schemes and systems of philosophy and found them all utterly empty and unsatisfying. So, philosophy, what is it referring here to? So, I mean, certainly the British tradition philosophy could also be natural philosophy.
Yes.
And of course, he himself was a natural philosopher in this category, or was he referring to, well, sort of, was it Leibniz or materialism? Did he think of that as
yeah, I think he's thinking in terms of world.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Okay, so the question is, what was meant in this statement at the end, where the minister says that he had gauged and fathomed all the schemes and systems of philosophy and found them utterly empty and unsatisfying and unworkable. What did he mean by, what did this writer mean by philosophy? And I think the answer is that what he was alluding to was different religious or other philosophical worldviews. So he was fundamentally commenting that Maxwell was a very sophisticated philosopher in a certain sense. I mean, after all, he studied philosophy for 3 years as an undergraduate, and he continued to pursue that to some extent. I mean, not a professional philosopher, but he was very widely read in philosophy in general. And I think what this man is saying is that here's a guy who had read all this philosophy, and he'd done all of this stuff, and yet in the end, he found all of those other ideas unworkable, and that he returned to Christianity. So that's the way I would interpret it.
Thank you. Now there was a question. Yes.
I was going to ask about the response to the Genesis and the light section at the end. Maxwell's response is an interpretation found in such a hypothesis, etc. Does that mean that he is that he thinks that science shouldn't have anything to say about the sacred text? I mean, are they, from your other reading of Maxwell, are they separate in
his mind? Do they influence each other, or is there a complete separation?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Should science have anything to say about the sacred text, like Genesis? We had something about that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. My interpretation of that interchange with the Bishop of Gloucester and Bristol is that Maxwell is very much shying away from a simple-minded kind of harmonization approach to the relationship between science and the Bible. So he definitely does not want to go down the route where you are going to either deduce science from the scriptures, definitely not, or in a certain sense deduce the right interpretation of the scriptures from science. He doesn't want to do that. So in that sense, I think the way you expressed it is he wants to keep them separate. I think the answer is sort of yes, okay? But it wasn't in some kind of fearful separation in his case. I don't think that for a moment. I think he was, obviously by his own testimony, someone who wanted to go and hear the Bible. He wanted to be at the Baptist minister's preaching because he knows his Bible and he preaches as close to it as he can. So Maxwell was definitely wanted to hear the scriptures expounded, and thought that they were, the foundation of his religious belief. But he was much too sophisticated a thinker to want a kind of simplistic harmonization. And so, I must confess that I find that kind of an attractive approach. I think Maxwell is, in a certain sense, a model, maybe a much older model than many we might look to today, but a model of how one might go about relating science and faith. There's a question back there.
That might be the last one. Yeah.
Is that because science was shifting and not coming to rest? So you didn't want to marry two things that are shifting, one's shifting?
Well, I think any answer to that would have to be a little bit speculative. Certainly, Maxwell gave us his reason why he didn't want that simplistic harmonization, that he didn't want scientific ideas to be bolstered by theological views. Isn't it a remarkable viewpoint, actually, is that he doesn't want, scientific hypotheses to be held above ground when they should long have been buried, okay? And that, as I mentioned earlier, is quite an insightful thought. So that's the reason he gives, but of course there may well have been other things that he was thinking about in the relationship between science and faith. As I said, you can tell from the way, for example, he expounds the scriptures in his letters to his wife and others' letters, that he's a very straightforward, orthodox, evangelical Christian. And yet, this was not in a kind of simplistic, fundamentalistic way. It was simply, for him, orthodoxy. Just the Bible made sense to him.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's probably the point at which we should break for coffee. So thank you very much.